Chapter 23. Monday, early afternoon. The cops helped Mac disperse the crowd. One of the guys headed into the mall to join the search for Cecily. They announced her name over the PA system, asking her to return to her vehicle, but after an hour there was still no sign of her. Mac looked at Doreen. Doreen looked at Mac and they both shrugged. "What's really going on here?" Stanley asked Mac. In a low voice, Mac told them as much as he could. The two officers looked at Doreen. She shrugged. "I called Mac when I found it," she said. "You should have called him while you were there," Stanley admonished. "Now evidence has likely been lost." "Which is why I followed the car," she said. "To see if she tried to dispose of the rest of the garbage." Stanley's partner Robert said, "I'll phone the chief. See if we can get some idea what to do about this." "You do that," Mac said with a heavy sigh. Nothing is ever easy about Doreen. The case was already closed as a murder-suicide until she got involved. Stanley nodded with a half grin. "And what's this I hear?" he said, turning to look at Doreen. "You've got some scuba diving enthusiasts going out on Tuesday?" Her gaze went to Mac, then down at her feet and the aging sandals she wore. Mac turned slowly to face her. "Doreen?" His voice turned ominous. She wrinkled her nose at him. "They just wanted to go scuba diving." "I don't know about that," Stanley said, a grin widening on his face. "They were pretty fired up about it. Looking for something in particular, from what I heard." With a groan, she let her shoulders slump. Somehow, she figured she'd get to Tuesday without having to explain it all to Mac. She should have known better. "You know Mac will never let me leave the house again, don't you?" she told Stanley. "From what I hear," Stanley said, "you can get into a heck of a lot of trouble without ever leaving that house of yours." "Isn't that the truth?" she said, but she then confessed to Mac. He hadn't been pleased, but when she had explained her theory, he had been quietly stunned. "That's very good thinking," he said. "I doubt they'll find anything, but I appreciate what you've done for the family's sake. Nobody even considered that all the times we discussed the cold case. There was absolutely no reason for Henry Huberts, a man with no criminal past, to take the little boy for nefarious purposes. I know there are secret pedophiles, but something about this didn't feel right. When I realized his grandson, Josh Huberts, had been accused of Celeste's murder, then believed to have committed suicide, I felt like that was another whammy for the family. If I could help solve one of those problems, then maybe it would be easier on them." Mac nodded. Roberts turned to look at her. "By the way, aren't you the one we put in the security for?" She smiled. "Yes, and thank you for that because honestly I can at least sleep at night now." "Nothing has triggered it?" "No. Although I don't hold any hopes that'll continue after seeing the intruder at the grocery store earlier today. I can't believe he's free to run around and break into my house again," she snapped. "I'm surprised you left the place long enough to follow this woman. But if she had anything to do with those two deaths." "So are you working for the police now?" Stanley said with a big grin. "You know, like part of the new volunteer amateur sleuths society?" "Oh God. Don't even get her started on something like that," Mac said instantly. "Roberts, did you get a hold of the chief?" "He's talking to the prosecutor to see what we can get." "Great," Mac said, turning to glare at Doreen. "You know that I'll never live this down." "You know what else?" "I'll never live this down either," she mimicked, shooting him a matching glare. "You didn't have to follow me, you know?" "That's about the only right thing I did do," he cried out. At that, Stanley howled with laughter. "You two are great together," he said with amusement. "You sound like an old married couple." Both Doreen and Mac turned to glare at him. Stanley raised both hands in mock surrender and, still chuckling, moved to where Roberts was once again on the phone. She turned to Mac. I don't know what marriages he's familiar with, but this is nothing like what my marriage was like. You weren't married, Mac snapped back. You were in bondage. She looked at him and after a long moment said, I really was, wasn't I? Her tone was very low and sad. All his aggression fell away. Hey, I didn't mean that. No, she said. But you should have meant it, because it is the truth. Sad but true. Don't take it too bad, he said. You're free now. She nodded and turned, leaning against the car. Thaddeus, realizing she wouldn't take him away, hopped onto her shoulder and gently brushed his beak against hers. Bondage, he said just once and in a low tone. She stroked his head. That's why you don't live in a cage. That's why, like Nan, I can't have you confined in any way. I spent 14 years in a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. She gently brushed and hugged the bird. Goliath was on her other side. He rubbed his head against that side of her face too. She stroked both of them, loving that at this moment, when she was feeling the pain of all she'd gone through, they were here for her. She looked up at the sound of a camera snap, expecting to see paparazzi. Instead, it was Mac. She looked at him in surprise. He turned the camera around so she could see the picture, and she stared in delight as both Thaddeus and Goliath had their heads turned against her. She had closed her eyes, and a gentle smile was on her face. Wow, she said. That's a very special picture. I'll send it to you. He nodded and paused. So you might have been in a gilded cage, he said, but you've given special lives to these two. Then he looked down at Muggs, who, in his typical fashion, was lying on her feet. He smiled. You may have turned this town upside down, but the animals sure appreciate their new lives. Roberts came back over and said, we're to try one more time to find her. If there's no sign of her in an hour, we're to open the trunk. Mac nodded. You guys head in and help find her. She's already gone, somebody said from among the officers a couple rows over. I saw her running out the back of the mall. She didn't look to be coming back anytime soon. On that note, Roberts nodded. Mac walked to his car, picked up a pry bar, and came back over. Before he opened the trunk, Doreen looked at him and said, You don't want to just unlock it from the inside? The three closest cops looked at her, looked at each other, walked over to the front door, and sure enough, the damn driver's door was unlocked. Swearing, Roberts hit the trunk button, and the trunk popped open. We'd really appreciate it, Stanley said, if you don't mention that to anybody. She gave him a breezy smile and a wave of her hand. I won't mention it. Believe me. I'd appreciate it if you didn't tell anyone about a few things either. He chuckled, and then his gaze fell to what was inside the trunk. He stopped laughing. That is a hell of a lot of blood. Not only were the bloody cloths here that Doreen had seen in the garbage can, but the carpet inside the trunk was completely soaked with blood too. She sighed. That's why I was following her. Mac nodded. And that's why I was following her too. The difference between us is I'm the cop and you're not. She stuck out her tongue at him. In that case, I get to go home now, don't I? And you get to stay and work. She gave them all a big wave, bundled up her animals, and headed home. Later that evening, Doreen got through another 10 hangers full of Nan's clothes, but her heart wasn't in it. She still burned with a sense of satisfaction from her day's adventures. But she hadn't had any follow-up from Mac. Now she half expected to never hear from him again. But with any luck, they would trace that blood back to Celeste. And then they would take a serious look at the case again. Doreen grabbed a book, sat on her bed, then felt just too tired for that. She went back downstairs, did another walk through the rooms checking that everything was still fine, made sure the alarms were set, then went back upstairs and crashed.